Hey, so welcome to part 2 of the Korps of Krieg by Arch. As always, I'm going to be leaving a link to the original video and channel down in the description below, so go ahead and make sure that you check them out. Let's go ahead and jump right into the video. I believe we left off of where he was starting to go into the vats and where the Krieg are born from that these days. So let's go ahead and see what else he kind of delves into.
In an Imperium that values the flesh, the humanity of its subjects more than anything, and in fact that views any form of artificial intelligence to be naturally inclined to wipe out any form of life, having people born entirely from artificial wombs, well, that smacks of, well, tech heresy, honestly. But clearly, the Death Corps soldiers have not suffered any ill effect whatsoever. They remain amongst the most loyal, dedicated, and bloody-minded stubborn of all of the Imperium's servants. In fact, when they became available in larger numbers to Imperial commanders, many stalemates that had lasted for decades were broken. Scenarios that would either require the mass expenditure of penal legion troops or the deployment of elite formations like the Adeptus Astartes or the Tempestus stormtroopers were now broken, using nothing but blood, grit, and the sheer determination of the Corps.
Alright, so as far as them not getting reprimanded for what would be obviously considered like heresy, right? Or tech heresy, it kind of reminds me of like the Adeptus Mechanicus, right? Because I know that they have their own guy that they worship. Can't remember the name off the top of my head, but that rubs a lot of people in the Imperium the wrong way, right? Because obviously they look at the Emperor as the one like true God, right? And they don't get reprimanded, obviously, because they're giving them, they're the ones that are giving them like their vehicles, their ships, their gear, their weapons, all things of that nature, right? And then I feel like that's also kind of the same thing with the Krieg here. That the reason maybe, I mean, it could just be that it's not the concern of the Imperium at this time, and it's more also like, hey, the Krieg are able to produce results, and if it's working, don't try to fix it type scenario, right?
The writing on the wall was clear indeed. Krieg's future had been decided. Eventually, Krieg was turned into an official Departamento Munitorum war world. This enforced the highest possible level of humanitarian ties upon the planet and also gave it access to the Departamento Munitorum's vast resources. Material started flowing into Krieg at an unprecedented rate, and its output of men and material skyrocketed. To the point that these days, Krieg does not raise Imperial Guard regiments. Krieg raises armies. Now, of course, it wasn't entirely perfect, pretty goddamn close as far as the Munitorum was concerned, but
also, real quick, just like a little quick comparison, right? Say for the U.S., for example, when they mentioned that the Krieg were actually getting a lot more resources and that they were actually producing more and like exporting them, and also exporting like kind of how we just said right here, like armies, right? Kind of remind me of the U.S. after World War II. That's when it really became like a superpower. So like after war, which I'm assuming right now this is after the Civil War, although yeah, because I mean these are nukes, and then 500 years later, yeah. So I would assume that this is after, and that a lot of times after like a conflict like that, someone's gonna rise up and like be able to have a certain amount of power, whether it's that physical power, whether it's resources or what have you, right? And it seems like obviously this is kind of what happened with the Krieg.
they needed to add in one minor change, that being the Commissariat. Now, granted, the Krieg Death Corps had never failed, not once, and their planet, despite being subjected to some of the harshest regulation in the Imperium, never batted so much as an eyelash at it. Yet, the Departamento Munitorum almost felt like this was just a little bit too good to be true. Undoubtedly, many a commissar assigned to the Death Corps figured to themselves that they got really unlucky. Usually, a commissar is required to encourage the formations they're attached to go beyond their duties, to sacrifice in the name of the Emperor. A Death Corps of Krieg commissar needs to instead try and keep them from sacrificing themselves unnecessarily. This rather unusual situation means that in the Death Corps, commissars are less political officers and more tactical advisors, trying to rein in the worst excesses of their attached regiments. Death Corps commissars also tend to have a remarkably high rate of casualties. It turns out that if you put somebody whose primary duty is to inspire loyalty and zeal in people, and then getting massively out-zealed by the regular guardsmen they're supposed to be inspiring, that tends to give the commissars a bit of an inferiority complex.
Okay, so the part about them getting the high casualties, right? Obviously, it's going to be because of the Krieg, or just kind of like go, very like trench type tactics, right? Just kind of throw everything you got, and hopefully some of them get through and then are able to break the line. I know this probably wouldn't be necessarily applicable to the Krieg specifically because of how they grow up or because just who they are. I feel like there's still a way to be as aggressive as they are, but to do it in a tactical type mindset, especially like say how he was saying with the commissary, right? I mean, I feel like that way you can like not only preserve lives, although I do understand it is Warhammer, but at least that way your sacrifice doesn't have to be a small one, right? For example, just getting hit by like a stray bullet or something, but you could, I guess, in a sense, have a bigger sacrifice, which I think that would be better, at least for the Krieg-wise. But then again, in Warhammer, obviously, especially with the Krieg, I would assume, or with any type of guardsman regiment, is that they're going to have so many people that it's not too big of a deal if they lose a couple thousand, right? Or maybe even like 100,000.
Leading them to commit greater and even more insane deeds of self-sacrifice and zeal than even the average Krieg's guardsman, in order to try and set some kind of example to them. Another vital role of a commissar entrenched with a Death Corps regiment is diplomacy. Whilst generally speaking, there is always a certain degree of friction expected whenever you place two Imperial Guard regiments from different worlds beside one another, the Death Corps is particularly antagonistic, shall we say. There are very few things about them that don't seem specifically designed to piss off regular people. One, they barely ever take their gas masks off, as they are trained to consider them a second skin. Wearing them at all times isn't technically required, but it is encouraged. Secondly, they are all raised from...
Okay, so now, I mean, obviously, I've heard people say that it's always like the second skin now, it's just a part of who they are. Okay, so it's not a necessity, but it's just a part of their culture, right? And it was kind of funny where it said it's highly encouraged, right? And a military type member will tell you that sometimes you get voluntold to do things, or hey, something isn't mandatory, but you will be there. Like what was it, like a family fun day? Where you're supposed to go there and legit have fun, but you have to stay there for a certain amount of time. So that just kind of reminded me about that.
Birth to believe in the cult of sacrifice. Essentially, this is the idea that nothing they could sacrifice for the Emperor could ever possibly be too much, or hell, even enough, really. You can imagine just how dour a bunch of people the Death Corps are, considering that they have been bombarded with this since their very birth, and considering they've also survived training, in which the casualty rate, even for Krieg and natives, is considered a bit appalling. Yeah, they're not exactly the life of the party, to put it mildly. To just add the final little cherry on top, they also nurture a strong disdain to anyone that isn't them. They view basically 96% of the rest of the galaxy as soft weaklings, and, well, in comparison, they certainly do have a point. Basically, if you are not the most rabid form of Emperor botherer, they will consider you to not be anywhere near pious enough, and they will tell you so, to your face, loudly and repeatedly. This means that wherever possible, Death Corps regiments should be deployed alongside other Death Corps regiments, which, fortuitously, considering the sheer volume of regiments Krieg produces, is quite often entirely possible. Or, alternatively, they should be placed alongside some other band of religious fanatics. They get along famously well with Maccabean Janissaries, for example, or other regiments who are overly fond of strict discipline, like, for example, the Mordian Iron Guard.
Okay, so the Janissaries, or Janissaries and the Mordian Guard, they kind of get along with, right? But as far as like obviously with some of the other regiments, I think you said like 96% they don't view them as, I guess, like quote unquote tough, right? Um, I wonder if there's been a situation or if there's like a story somewhere, maybe like a short story where you got Kriegs just kind of talking to each other and they're kind of just shooting the stuff just to kind of see what they talk about, or is it all just about war? I kind of one of those boys type moment to just see what kind of goes through the head. And maybe, I mean, I kind of got to ask if there's moments where a Krieg thinks differently than other Krieg, right? Like, you know, that one little individual, right?
And now that we've just touched upon the Cult of Sacrifice a little bit, it's time to talk about it, the Cult of Sacrifice, and the training for the Death Corps. Firstly, what is the Cult of Sacrifice? Well, it is the idea, as mentioned, that no sacrifice is too great. This is hammered into every single child on Krieg from the very moment they are born. They are told that the great sacrifice made by their forefathers during the nuclear cleansing of their world initiated by Colonel Jurgen was the first great sacrifice that they had to commit to make up for the atrocities committed by the ruling Council of Autarchs, who have been turned into some kind of combination of Satan, Beelzebub, Lucifer, and Hitler. And yes, I know several of those are basically the same thing, but I'm just trying to illustrate just how thick they smeared it on when it comes to the Council of Autarchs. They are literally the worst thing to have ever happened ever. In fact, your average Krieg's guardsman, if asked, would probably have to vex lyrically about whether or not Horus was really quite as bad as the High Council. And since Krieg was the planet who birthed such an absolute atrocity, there is quite simply no limit to the amount of sacrifice that Krieg should be expected to provide in the Emperor's service. And mind you, this is not strictly limited to martial sacrifice. It also involves the quote-unquote civilian population, although there isn't really anyone who could be considered a civilian on Krieg, or at the very least, not in the way that we would normally use the word. You see, the entirety of Krieg society is focused around nothing else but churning out as many guardsmen, as many guns, as many artillery pieces, as many tanks as it is possible. This means that essentially the entire population is engaged in warfare in one way or the other. All of the fit menfolk, and indeed even the non-fit ones, are pretty much universally recruited into the Death Corps of Krieg. Now, of course, there are always the occasional exceptions here and there, but they are few and far between. Meanwhile, the female part of the population, along with the children...
Okay, I was kind of thinking about that too. Like, are there females, or because obviously I heard about them being all, if not all of them, or the majority, like 90% of them being born in vats. Would it have been necessary for like a? I mean, I would assume they would need some kind of female DNA, right? I mean, I'm assuming they use the sperm and the egg, you know, what have you, and then obviously make it into this vat. So okay, they do have females, and was it the part about the Horus heresy, or as far as the Autarch, the upper class guys who rebelled, that they would be worse than Horus? I mean, did the Krieg know about Horus? How many people actually knew about Horus? Because I feel like that's something the Imperium man, and at least the Space Marines that were in that area, and maybe Guardsmen, I don't think there was any that I can remember, would try to keep that under wraps, possibly. But then again, I feel like, I mean, because no matter how many Astartes there are, it's always been said in multiple videos that they're still considered very angelic, and that most people are not going to be able to ever see one in their lifetime, right? So I'm assuming that's something that they would kind of keep under wraps. So I don't know if the Krieg would actually know about them.
Mind you, are pretty much all working in the factories. As you can probably imagine, there's not much of a childhood period at all on Krieg. You're working in the factories in one way or another pretty much as soon as you're able to walk on your own. For the male part of the population, this is a brief period of relative safety. Relative as in there's only so safe you can ever get whilst living on a highly industrialized subterranean hive world where the entirety of the rest of the planet, e.g. anything above ground, is laced with lethal radiation. This, by the way, is pretty much also the only chance they have of escaping a fate in the Death Korps of Krieg. Mind you, most of them don't want to. They have been raised on the ideas of a heroic sacrifice since they were old enough to understand words. Most of them consider the idea of finally being recruited into the Death Korps as an honor, something that they look forward to, something to celebrate when it happens, but if they manage to develop some form of talent or they prove themselves particularly valuable. Let's for example say that you've got a full-on mechanical genius. He is
Before he gets to the being a genius, as far as them considering it a big honor, right? I mean, obviously considering that, what he called it, the cult of sacrifice, and like just growing up in that type of environment consistently, someone probably being told that your entire life, right, to be able to sacrifice yourself. Would they see it as, I mean, I feel like the majority probably see it as an honor, but I feel like there would be a select, maybe few that would kind of see it as, if you're going to die, hopefully it's a quick round to the head from like an orc or something, and that way you can kind of escape that life, right? I mean, considering the fact that it doesn't really seem like there's any happy ending, specifically with the Krieg. I mean, obviously, lots of parts of the Warhammer universe, but for them, if they can sacrifice, then I guess that's their peaceful sunset type ending, right? It's kind of weird to think of it like that way, because I mean, the only other format that I've seen that is like what people were telling me, and when I saw about the orcs, right, Tuska Daemon Killer, since they enjoy war, that's kind of what they do, and that's kind of what their happy ending is, right? So I thought that was a little bit of a comparison.
Increased the productivity of his workstation by several 100%. He is just incredible at his job. In that case, his overlord might decide that it would be better for the wider war effort for him to remain on Krieg, but these are very, very much so the exceptions, rather than the rule. And then, of course, comes the actual training for the Death Korps. If you've been paying even the slightest amount of attention, you will probably have gathered by now that Krieg is not exactly a nice place to grow up. You wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning, you've got maybe half an hour to chow down some absolutely terrible breakfast, probably consisting of some form of regurgitated, reconstituted, and recycled waste material. After which, it's off to work, which almost invariably takes place in some form of massive industrialized factory complex that never ceases operation. You've got a 12-hour shift, and some sad-ass motherfucker has the 12-hour shift after you. Unless you are fortunate enough to be some form of administratum or departmentum munitorum clerk, your job is likely to be noisy, filthy, dangerous, and exhausting. Furthermore, you are fed just enough to maintain maximum productivity and make sure that you don't die, at the very least, not from starvation. And if you are lucky enough to actually receive wages, it's not going to be a whole lot, to put it like that, and even if you did get a lot of money, what the hell is there to spend it on? You are on Krieg. Luxury goods is not exactly at the top of the priority list for the Departamento Munitorum. And yet all of that is going to appear as if nothing more than a pleasant, fluffy dream once you're finally enrolled into the Death Korps of Krieg. Those of you who have been in the army have probably had the pleasure of getting intimately acquainted with a drill sergeant or two. Now, of course, drill sergeants are a part of any functional army, and they take...
Real quick with the DIs, for the Marine Corps side of things, we call them drill instructors, not drill sergeants, but quick funny thing, as soon as they found out who I was, right, because obviously some people kind of are in the background. I was trying to be in the background just so I didn't get messed with so much, but it wasn't until second phase, and they asked me a question specifically. I don't remember what the question was, but all of a sudden I stuttered, and then that's kind of what they knew me from then on. And sure, they laughed at me, but it's like, okay, now that's kind of my thing. You know, I'm the one that stutters, and anytime they needed someone to say something or yell something out loud, they say, "Martinez, get over here." And I'm walking up like, aye, sir. But I did not curse. That does not count as a curse.
tend to be extraordinarily verbose and vicious creatures. Quick to anger and slow to forget, they are the intransigent elephants of any armed forces. Furthermore, they primarily sustain themselves by feeding off the suffering of others. Therefore, it is most fortunate for them that their chosen profession provide them with such an ample supply of fresh-faced recruit to torture. Incidentally, their chosen form of sustenance is also the reason why they seem to always be awake before anybody else. As you can probably imagine, after going several hours without bullying some poor white shield, their monstrous little bellies must be absolutely famished. The point is that the drill sergeant truly is one of God's more heinous creatures, but there is also a soft, quivering pinkness to them. At the end of the day, despite their fondness for pain and suffering, their job is to break you down, so they can build you up better, and some of the fluffiest men I've ever known wear their stripes with pride. The Death Corps also has drill sergeants, but there is one pertinent difference. They have no interest in tearing you down to build you back up. They are of the opinion that if you can be torn down in the first place, then you are simply not Death Corps material, and the best thing they can do both for you and the Corps is to break you as quickly as possible, either fatally or by sending your, in all due likelihood, crippled ass back to the factory lines.
Okay, so now that's an interesting concept, right? Now, specifically, speaking on the Marine Corps side of things, right? They do the whole thing about breaking you down and building you back up because you're coming as a civilian and they're really trying to get you in that military aspect, and you only got 3 months to do it. So it's a lot of whole shock and awe real quick, kind of get you thrusted into the military type lifestyle that you're going to be in for the rest of your contract. And yeah, I mean, for the most part, some people handle it pretty well. Some people struggle with it. Some people end up really thinking like, hey, this is really not for me, even though they did sign the contracts and all that. It doesn't matter if they say, oh, we changed our mind. Well, you signed it, right? Nobody forced you. And that was always something they kind of reminded us, right? So, but then again, I can see why. I mean, so you get a bunch of high schoolers, but obviously this is a real good indication of how much you're willing to commit to something once you've really said that you would. So, because of that, though, you get a lot of people that really snake by, in a sense, right? And because of that, I feel like the end product, which, to put it nicely, gets very diluted as far as the quality, right? Because you got some people that don't want to be there, and then a lot of them are going to get out either way as soon as they get to their duty station. Because that's really where a lot of them typically end up claiming a lot of things that are wrong with them. Then they end up getting out, and then they claim all these other types of things that they got, like PTSD and some other types of things that I don't want to go into too deep. But they try to get as many benefits as they can from the VA that they really don't need, and they're just trying to get money out of it. And besides that, though, you get very less people at the very end, right? But in the beginning, it looks like a lot. So it looks like a lot good number-wise. But now I can see from the Krieg perspective, right? If we incorporated their version of just breaking them down, and if you broke down, you wouldn't have been much of a Marine later on down the road, right? But then again, the Krieg have a completely different type of lifestyle. I would assume even like their kids are way mentally stronger than a whole lot of people say in today's world, right? Considering the environment they grow up in, the culture they grow up in, and just their life in general, right? Really. But because of that, I feel like they get a much purer product at the end. But then again, a lot of them die because the whole charting straightforward type deal. So let me know down in the comments if you think their version of it, as far as breaking you down, if you break, you're out. Let me know in the comments if that would be a good thing to transition to like today's military. And it really doesn't matter whatever branch. Just tell me if you think that would be a good idea.
Death Corps training, unsurprisingly, is a bit on the brutal side. It is not necessarily that different from the training doctrines in and of themselves of other regiments. However, the key difference lies in the implementation. Other regiments have mock battles. The Corps has them, but they use live artillery. Other regiments may train in bayonet combat. The Corps also does this, with unsheathed and fully sharpened bayonets. Other regiments may train men to stay down by firing a machine gun over their heads as they crawl along a trench. The Corps does this as well. It simply dispenses with the pretense and orders the MG crew to try their damnedest to hit anyone stupid enough to be spotted.
You know, at this point, I shouldn't be surprised that they're actually doing this. Which, I mean, granted, it'll put you in the mindset like, hey, I better do everything I'm taught and listen, otherwise I'm going to get schwacked. All right? But then again, it's a very high risk, type scenario.
Devil, as they say, is in the details. Or in this case, I suppose it's probably more like the Grim Reaper. And let's pause for a moment on the idea of mutilation on Krieg. Yes, I know, a somewhat morbid pause, but I wish to try and emphasize just how much of a shithole this really is, because the simple fact that you're basically a slave, chained forever to a massive churning war machine that cares diddly dick for your well-being, that alone is not quite enough. Imagine being one of the menfolk on Krieg. Imagine entering into the Death Corps and getting hurt. Imagine standing in the wrong position when an artillery shell falls out of the sky and losing half of your leg, for example. In our modern society, there is a vast network of support organizations specifically designed to try and allow you to continue living your life with as little inconvenience as possible considering your injury. On Krieg, not only does that not...
If they're talking about the VA, I'm going to tell you right now, I haven't had any experience with them just because I wasn't really too injured when I got out. But from what I hear from my peers, it's a bit of a hassle to even try to get them on the phone.
Exist, but think about this. If the entirety of society has been raised on the idea that sacrifice is everything, indeed, the only value your life has is the amount of sacrifice you are capable of personally making in the name of the Imperium, how do you think they might treat somebody who, technically speaking, failed to make the maximum sacrifice by becoming a member of the Death Korps of Krieg and dying for the Emperor? And not only that, he gets sent back into the rest of society as a cripple. He is going to require special resources. He is going to require medical time. He is going to require certain aids, crutches, wheelchairs, these kinds of things. And he is probably going to be less effective at producing stuff in the factories than a hale and hearty man. Obviously enough. How do you think such a society might treat someone like that? I'd reckon not particularly fucking good. If you're...
But I mean, if someone got hurt on the battlefield, right, wouldn't it also be like maybe a good idea to keep whatever knowledge they have, especially if they're like, say, someone who was higher up on the chain of command, and they keep them around for like knowledge, maybe reading maps, maybe give them a job that doesn't really require them to be on the front lines all the time, but just something so like they can have some form of unit cohesion, right? If you know what I'm talking about. It's basically someone in a leadership role is still able to provide that leadership, although they may not be on the front lines.
You're going to get into an accident while training for the Death Corps. It better be a fatal one, because the old saying holds true, especially on Krieg. No matter how shit your training is, no matter how arse your life has been up until this point, it can always get worse. But hope isn't entirely lost for the poor bastard who inevitably gets enrolled within the Death Corps, because there are a few ways he could actually, possibly, potentially, maybe, although extremely unlikely, better his lot. Not that your average Death Corps guardsman would actually give a shit about that, but still, for the sake of argument. There are several positions within the Death Corps that are, if not particularly cushier, at the very least slightly safer than the others. Krieg does not have much of an aristocracy, or, well, at least not anymore. The most in the way of an aristocracy they might have are the various supervisors and bosses that run the factories, and those really aren't much of an aristocracy at all. And that, of course, means that the officers of the Death Corps are invariably drawn from the Death Corps itself. Generally speaking, they are veterans from other regiments already formed that, through a mixture of luck, skill, perseverance, and perhaps a little bit of the Emperor's favor, have somehow managed to actually survive in the Death Corps for an extended period of time. Now, you might think that mere survival itself isn't really enough of a qualification for officers training, but, well, this is the fucking Death Corps. They really don't have a whole lot of other qualifications to go by, frankly. And
So, throw away everything I just said about the leadership thing if somebody gets injured. Seems like the only way to actually get promoted, I guess, is if you live long enough. Kind of from what I just got. I mean, obviously, just because, like, the amount of people that they're losing, and I'm assuming that they lose them pretty frequently, kind of considering what their tactics would be. But it seems like at least a majority of it, I'm pretty sure it's not everything, but a majority of it is probably just dependent on, like, how we say, kind of like luck and how long they've been alive.
Considering the relative simplicity of the Death Corps' favourite tactic, e.g. line up vast quantities of men and then walk them slowly towards machine gun positions, you don't exactly require a Lord Solar level tactical genius to implement them, at the very least with a decent degree of precision. Though to be fair, this is actually a bit of an acquired skill. If you were to put, for example, a Cadian officer in charge of a Death Corps formation, he probably would lose all respect amongst his men the moment that he didn't suggest the most ridiculous, suicidal, self-sacrificing tactics possible. And if he were so silly as to suggest that maybe he should direct the battle from a bunker somewhere behind the lines, well, in all due likelihood, his soldiers would simply just wander off and do whatever they felt best, as clearly that officer was utterly insane. And of course, the reverse scenario also holds true. There has been experiments where Death Corps officers have been put in charge of non-Death Corps formations. The idea was that since these officers clearly have a certain knack for completing the most...
Okay, first of all, before he gets into that, how that would turn out, it's something I never really thought about, right? As far as taking like people from different regiments and putting them in different leadership positions in other regiments. So I'm going to make an assumption here. I feel like the Krieg, right? You got this guy right here, gets put in like kind of like how he was saying, like say for a Acadian regiment. I feel like he would tell them to charge. They would say, no, that's dumb. We're just going to waste their own people. Because I'm assuming, like, say if the Acadians would do things a lot differently, tactic-wise. And I feel like they would maybe shoot their own guys. Kind of like from the, what was that one movie where there was, like, that Russian sniper versus, like, a German sniper at the enemy's gate or something. Damn, it was also loosely based on the World at War Call of Duty game, the little sniping scene. But in any case, kind of with that, and when they're barely getting to, was it Stalingrad, and then some guys are jumping out of the boat, right? Because when they're coming in, some of the officers just go in, they're shooting them because they're essentially deserting. I feel like that's kind of the scenario that is going to happen, right? Or would happen.
Complicated of battlefield objectives. You know, that might have more to do with the forces they are commanding rather than their tactical flair, but hey, details. They should be put in charge of other regiments. The problem is, of course, that the men of Krieg are a very, very special breed indeed, and even Maccabi and Janissaries will probably flinch at the idea of simply walking slowly across an open field towards pillboxes. It really does require a certain mindset, and that mindset is not found in many places outside of Krieg. As such, a Death Corps officer in charge of any non-Death Corps regiment is likely to find himself sacrificing for the Emperor in a highly accidental manner, probably by falling on his bayonet several times or accidentally discharging his last pistol into the back of his skull. You know, that kind of stuff. But even then, despite the fact...
Okay, so I had it backwards. You just suicide, I guess.
The Death Corps officers tend to have basically as Spartan, if not even more so of a lifestyle than the average Krieg guardsman, because after all, he needs to set an example. At the very least, he has slightly higher odds of living than the rest of the guardsmen, since even the most self-sacrificing Krieg officer understands that he is far more useful in directing his men, rather than wandering out in front of them and getting shot first. Now, granted, they still do prefer directing their men from a couple dozen meters behind the front line, rather than 3.5 kilometers, so, you know, safe is a relative term, yes, but it is safer, and, as an officer, you get access to some of the perks of being an officer in Death Corps of Krieg.
I would say I kind of knew that if they were in that type of formation where they're just kind of charging, I would assume that officers would be somewhat close to the front. I mean, obviously he's not on the front, he said maybe a couple... Did he say a couple dozen? Or still somewhat close to the front, right? Instead of being like quite a bit in the back, to be able to kind of like, say, move you guys like in little chess pieces, right? It could inspire the guys to fight a little harder. But obviously, if you have a leadership get schwacked, I feel like that could cause some kind of, just kind of amongst everybody else, like, hey, what do we do now? Do we do what we were told? Like, hey, we were told to charge. Do we still charge? What do we do after we take that trench or whatever it is, right? So it's always very risky. So it's kind of one of those things, as far as in the Marine Corps as well, right? Especially when we were doing mount training, Sometimes at one point we had a lieutenant that really liked trying to be the first one in the stack and had consistently kind of pull him back and tell him, hey, sir, um, that's basically a no-go. Like, we don't want the leadership to be at the front. If you get taken out, because you're going to be a prime target for the enemy if they're looking to take someone out, right? Especially a sniper. And it's the same thing. Although a doc isn't, for example, in a leadership type position, right? We still wouldn't want him to be at the front of the stack because, like, very crucial to us, right? So I guess I could see it. I can see it both ways, but I feel like at least Krieg-wise, maybe put them in the middle of the entire thing. That way, they're still not all the way back, but they're also somewhat closer to the front, somewhat. That way, just keep them alive, inspire the men, things of that nature.
These perks are, you get your personal little posse of a command squad, you have a dude to carry your Vox for you, you get a fancy-ass helmet with a golden bird on it, and you get a kick-ass greatcoat. If that isn't a step up, I just don't know what is. But, of course, there is a teeny-weensy tiny little problem, namely that to actually become a Death Corps officer, you will have to survive the Death Corps for a very, very long time before that point, which, well, let's face it, that could be rather complicated. But there are several other specializations within the Death Corps that might possibly give you a halfway decent chance of not getting brutally maimed and murdered, at the very least in your first engagements. One of these would be the Death Corps' Grenadiers. Now, yes, this does mean that you would be entering into the specialized assault formations of the Death Corps, which, yes, that...
Okay, so this is kind of like their soft guys, right? Special Operation Forces. So, being the Grenadier. By the way, I'm not a fan, was never a fan of anything that I was by that could be exploded, right? Anytime I was given a frag, I was always very, death grip on it. Make sure I put it in right. Make sure there was no possible way it could ever get stuck on anything, say if I was in the prone or if it just got stuck in some random twig or something. I was very paranoid. And this also reminded me of when a buddy of mine who had actually, his thumb clip had came off, but obviously the whole twist pull pin. Pulling an actual pin on a grenade is a little, it takes a little bit of force. Not a whole lot, but still quite a bit. He was missing the thumb clip, right, which is the first thing that you take off. Now, it took him about 2 minutes, because after a few minutes of not being able to find it, I would have told him, hey, you got to tell somebody, because this isn't something that we could just leave for someone else to find, right? Or if it maybe gets stuck on something, and then luckily he was able to find it, was able to put it back on, and that was that. So, not a fan of explosives at all.
It is going to be just about as dangerous as you think it will, but you will have access to some additional armor, bigger guns, and tons of grenades, so at the very least you'll be equipped to survive, if nothing else. Oh, and by the way, you're going to have to be fucking massive to get into them. The Death Corps Grenadiers are kind of inspired by the Potsdam Giants, which is a formation from our own military history, where a particularly faggoty little Prussian prince decided that his special guards unit should be made up of nothing but massive strapping menfolk who looked adorable in uniform. Because why not? In the case of the Death Corps Grenadiers, however, they are not selected purely to be the fetish objects of some tiny little Prussian. Instead, they are selected for their size, their experience, and their aggressive spirit to form an elite formation of shock troopers. They are expected to be able to go toe-to-toe with anything the 41st millennium can throw at them. And considering the sheer amount and hideousness of shit that 40k can throw at your average guardsman, they could probably use the advantage of being above average build. But of course, merely just being a big boy isn't enough to stop a charging orc knob from snipping you in two with a power claw. As such, they are also equipped with a bit of specialized equipment. They will be issued with far more grenades, both frag and crack, than your average guardsman. They also have the privilege of...
Did you say crack? I mean, I never really thought about. Obviously, you have the assassins, right? They're souped up on all kinds of drugs and all that. But honestly, because even during the World Wars, was it the Nazis even had that they were using I don't know if it was crack or meth. I think they were using meth, right, to stay up and that. I didn't even think about that as far as it translating into this, if that is the case. or maybe he just said crack to refer to something else. But if they are using drugs, I honestly wouldn't doubt it.
Being equipped with carapace armor. This should give them a decent chance of taking on at least 1 or 2 hits from most enemy infantry weapons, and even a potential chance of surviving a hit from something big, brutal, and nasty, like for example a bolter. Not a particularly great chance, but a chance nonetheless. And of course, the best way of making sure that you will survive an enemy aiming a weapon at you is to shoot them in the face before they get to shoot you. To ensure that the Death Corps Grenadiers have enough oomph to put down even the nastiest creatures that might point a weapon at them, they are equipped with the Type 14 Lasgun H. This is the heavy, overcharged version of the standard lasgun. The 14H, also known as a Hell Gun, is capable of putting out roughly 40 to 50% more energy per shot than the standard lasgun. As such, it requires a considerably larger energy source, and this is worn as a backpack on the Grenadier's back. The total output of this larger power pack is around about 200 shots, depending on the power setting and of course the weapon's condition, and that is one of the really big things.
So 200 shots before you got to reload. But is it like an... does it fire like... What would be the fire rate, right? Like, is it one shot every couple of seconds? Because maybe it can overheat, or maybe they can do like a sustained type fire. And also, based off of that, when he said that this armor could actually take maybe bolter rounds and you might be able to survive, and I think he said a couple shots from maybe a lasgun, I think it was. Kind of like with the flag that you would wear in the Marine Corps. It could take a couple rounds. I don't remember the exact amount of like 7.62, and so it pretty much just cracks, right? And also with the the Kevlar, I always thought it was meant to like kind of do the same thing as the flak, but it's more along the lines of being able to deflect bullets. So as you can see, there's even like the little what would you call it? Like that little part where it comes down and then it kind of scoops out to the side, right? So that would be, so if a round is coming in, especially like in Kevlar that we have today, it's designed to more hit, but then because of the angle, it deflects, And obviously that doesn't happen all the time. Sometimes it just goes straight through, depending on the angle, but, just thought that was pretty interesting.
Condition. You see, whilst the Hell Gun is a considerably more potent weapon than the lasgun, for example, whilst the standard issue Imperial flashlight might in most cases tickle an orc, and you're going to need half a squad's worth of them to really put the bastard down, a Hellgun blast to the face is going to put most greenskins down rather hard and quickly. This increased killing power, however, comes at a severe cost, both to the total capacity of the weapon, a mere 200 rounds, which is not fantastic at all, considering the sheer size and weight of the contraption, in addition to, of course, the fact that the Grenadiers are usually used as shock troopers. That means close-in, personal, and brutal fighting. They might also be required to hold the objectives they just recently captured for extended periods of time while the rest of the Corps batter their bloody little asses to them. Thusly, having a relatively mere 200 rounds at one's disposal is not ideal. Of course, steps are usually taken to remedy this. Whilst the sheer size and bulky nature of the pack means that it would be highly impractical to have one man carry 2 of them, Grenadier formations could, however, and should, wherever possible, be supported by Chimera armored transports, not only to ensure that the Grenadiers actually make it to their target, but also so that the Grenadiers can shove the little Chimeras as full of additional power packs as humanly possible.
Yeah, I was also thinking about that, right? Especially since you got these like little tanks things over here. But also I was thinking that maybe you would also put like some like your regular troops with them, the ones who have like the other type of las guns and are able to actually, I guess, use their las guns instead of this hell gun, and reserve this for like more dire situations. But obviously if they got all these tanks that they're being supported with, and they're able to carry their ammo with them, and maybe even carry more guys, right? So like you can at least ensure they're gonna have an extra amount of people to be able to help you defend kind of whatever area you're actually at. But so far, great gun, great firepower, better than your typical las gun, but very limited on its rounds, considering how many enemy, specifically if you're going against orcs, for example, in the Green Tide, it could be pretty problematic because there's a lot more than 200.
Another drawback, however, that is considerably more difficult to get around is the fact that the Hellgun is an extraordinarily temperamental little lady. And if you do not take the absolute best care of her, she's going to act up at the absolute worst possible timing. The Hellgun requires extensive, lengthy, and complicated maintenance, and it requires it often. Otherwise, the power of each individual last blast will start to decrease, the rate of fire will start falling off, and the weapon itself will start developing some rather unfortunate and wonky side effects. Let's just say that if you're carrying around a weapon capable of stopping an orc in its tracks, then you probably don't want it overheating too badly, now do you? And one final little problem. The Hellgun is moody at the best of days. This means that using it as a close combat weapon, as you can do with the humble lasgun by bashing someone over the head with the butt end, or using it with a bayonet, is simply not an option. If you whack somebody over the head with a Hellgun, well, you'd best be prepared for a somewhat explosive finale, let's just say. It's not guaranteed that it'll blow up, but the odds are not on your side. Additionally, the Hellgun does not come with a bayonet lug, and considering, again, that these are stormtroopers expected to get up close and personal with the enemy, that is a pretty major problem once again. And no, unfortunately, you can't just scratch build one and attach it, because the problem isn't the design of the barrel. The problem is that the las bolts fired from the weapon are so hot that it will literally start melting the bayonet. The Hellgun, the poor thing, has a lot of drawbacks, but the men of Krieg follow regulations, and regulation says that grenadiers are supposed to carry Hellguns. At least it is some small comfort that grenadier formations also use a high percentage of specialized weapons. Flamers, shotguns, plasma guns, melter guns, that kind of stuff. Although, I'm not entirely sure whether I would prefer to carry a Hellgun or a plasma gun, since both of the weapons have an uncomfortably high percentage chance of murdering their users.
Okay, so like with any weapon, obviously you've got to maintain it. But this seems kind of on the extreme side as far as taking care of it. Obviously, it could blow up on you. But then again, when he was talking about the bayonet, the fact that it would melt, right, with consistent use of the actual gun, could they not carry a pistol? Or like a last pistol or something, right, to kind of help within that enclosed area and also not maybe save some of the rounds from this Hell gun when they're in more of a close quarter type area. And I'm pretty sure they could just put it on their hip, anywhere really on them. I mean, obviously he didn't go into like how heavy like the backpack is, how heavy the gun is, and if it really is connected with these tubes, it could pretty limit your range of motion. And the fact that you can really holster this weapon, because obviously I would assume that they don't really have too many slings, especially when I've heard that most guardsmen are typically just given a las gun, right? Considering how many there are, they don't necessarily have a whole lot of gear. But in this case scenario, I feel like he's got some room, depending on how heavy everything is that he's carrying right now with all that carapace armor as well. Might be able to carry a pistol, at least. I'm sure he's got a shovel somewhere in there. Maybe this is the shovel end right here. But I feel like, damn, because it seemed like a great job at first, considering that you have a little more firepower. You might be a little limited on your rounds. But then seeing how many enemies are probably going to be coming at you at once, and then you're having to get into a close quarter, being a shock troop and all that, especially in the initial kind of push, it's got its pros and cons. I feel like I would rather be someone in a vehicle at this point, if I was in the Krieg. Alright, so real quick, let's talk about that for a minute. Now, if you made it this far, I really do appreciate it, because sometimes I forget things, or things just, my mind kind of goes blank during the video. And I know that some of you actually listen all the way to the end, because you know I have this little end discussion where I kind of maybe reiterate some things, or just ask the questions that are kind of slipped my mind right now. Didn't really have too much. I was able to make sure I took enough pauses in between and was going to edit them during the editing process to be able to make sure I got everything out and to really kind of cut down these end of discussions. So the next end of discussion after this one is probably going to be a lot shorter, just because really taking my time now on the actual videos. So the cult of sacrifice, everything just being literally designated on how much you can give back to the emperor, right? Considering the whole thing with the Civil War, and actually just having to be in that scenario where you're trying to consistently receive redemption, but you're really willing to just like kind of throw your life into it, whether it's because you think it's a great honor, maybe you see it as a quick way to get out of a horrible life. The part about the training was probably the biggest aspect that really stuck with me. Do you think that could work as far as, or maybe if it was a different type of branch somewhere, something that if you get broken down and you crack, or if you just really realize, hey, this isn't for you, and they just kick you out, because that way, hey, you save yourself some time from training them, but then again, you also save someone who probably later on down the line is probably going to get out either way, or is going to be trying to get out, or it's probably just going to be a horrible Marine down the future, right? And then later on, the purity of the people coming out is actually a whole lot stronger, right? And you might have less, but obviously this would be built up during time. I'm very curious to see what your guys' thoughts are going to be on that in the comments, right? To see if that would work in today's world, or is it too PC for that kind of thing? Which I don't think the military, in my opinion, should be really PC focused, just because I feel like that draws a lot of what's going on, and I feel like the fact that there's not a whole lot of, as weird as it might sound, like there's not a whole lot of action going on. So I feel like that way, instead of focusing on just getting people ready to go into especially if you're in a combat type role, right, where we're literally just training you. When people were like in Iraq and Afghanistan, they're just training you to go straight out there and to be able to go fight, right? And a lot of times, from what I was hearing from stories, that a lot of times you would kind of learn things on the fly, right? I feel like when that isn't happening, there's a lot more time that the chain of command is consistently just trying to change things to mix things up, and a lot of times it could be into micromanaging, or it could be things that they're doing things just to kind of do things because they feel like that could probably make the Marine Corps stronger, for example. Or, for example, say with the Army, right, they took out the shark attacks, which I think was a horrible idea. When you get to boot camp or basic or wherever, you really got to switch into that mindset. Hey, you're not going to be a civilian anymore. You're no longer a kid or a teen, or technically a teen, but you're no longer in a kid type mentality where mom and dad is going to kind of do everything for you and that they're just going to kind of hold your hands, right? You chose to join the military, and you're going to start acting in a military type manner. So that was the real biggest thing that really stuck out to me, because I feel like these days they're really trying to dumb down boot camp or dumb down anything, which even when I went through it, it wasn't even that hard. It was just really tedious at some points, right? But like, say, from what you were hearing in the 70s and 80s, how things were going, say for in an example in Vietnam, you got a lot of people who are very, very mentally strong, right? And I don't know, I mean, that's just kind of my view on it. Let me know what you're thinking down in the comments, though, about it. As far as getting into some of their special classes, as far as Kriegsmen, I didn't even know that they did have any. I was kind of assuming that they were all just kind of your basic standard ground troops, but it's good to know that they have some form of specialized, like their kind of own soft type of guys. So it's going to be interesting to see kind of what more that they have actually later on in the video in the part 3, and just kind of see like how that goes. I'm really hoping that they have some kind of sniper, because I feel like that would be pretty cool, Krieg-wise. But that's going to go ahead and do it for this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, really does help me a lot. Hit that notification bell so you get notified every time I do upload. And hit that dislike button if you didn't like the video. Leave me a little comment as to maybe what it was. Currently working around on a lot of things. I got a green screen coming, so this background's going to be changed. Don't worry. And then I'm working on so many things as far as improving the channel. I was able to get help from actually a pretty big YouTuber. I don't know if I want to name names, but helped me a lot as to what I can improve on. Thumbnails are going to be changing as well. I'm really focusing on trying to get my thumbnail game up. But great things, you know, they're going to take some time. But thank you for going for this long, and I'll see you all in the next video.